Good afternoon or morning, whenever you're listening to this webcast. This is going to be your introduction to the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement. I'm going to focus from 1947 right up to this very day. When you think about a civics class, you think about the words liberty, equality, justice. These are the main goals I think we could argue that we try to achieve in a democratic republic, something that has eluded us for most of our history. And the modern civil rights movement has been very successful in moving the ball towards more equality, more opportunity, more justice, and more liberty for all. So let's take a look at this. And as you can see on my cover page, I have a baseball player by the name of Jackie Robinson sliding into home. Great baseball player. You don't see too many players able to steal home anymore, but he had a great skill at doing that. A lot of people start the modern day civil rights movement with Brown versus Board of Education or Rosa Parks actions on the bus. Certainly, those are great moments in American history in the civil rights movement. But when I've studied it, I really go back to April 15th, 1947, to where it starts. I will argue it starts on a baseball field in Brooklyn. Of course, you know my bias, being a big baseball fan. But I could make a great historical argument for that, as others have. So let's take a look at why I'm starting here. Branch Rickey was the president and general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Yes, Brooklyn, not Los Angeles. If you didn't know, New York had 3 professional baseball teams from the 1920s through the 1950s. You had the New York Yankees in the American League. In the National League, you had the New York Baseball Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. Later, Brooklyn and New York Giants would move to Los Angeles and San Francisco in the late 50s, and that will lead a void, and then our beloved Mets would come to take their spot in 1962. That's why you have the blue and orange uniforms for the Mets, okay, honoring the Brooklyn Dodgers blue and the New York Giants orange. So a little baseball history for you. So why are we starting here with Branch Rickey? Branch Rickey was a great student, very bright man, tried to be a professional baseball player, but was unable to do that. But he had a great baseball mind, and people recognized this. So at a very young age, he found himself in positions of power. In the 1920s, he would be a manager of a college baseball team, and he did not have a lot of experience with segregation. And one of his players, by the name of Clarence Thomas, was on the team bus when they went to Indiana. And on the way to playing one of their first away games, they stopped at a gas station. Bus was getting gas, and Clarence Thomas was denied entry into the restroom. We had Jim Crow laws back then, as you know, separate public facilities for blacks and whites. Branch Rickey was very upset by this, told the gas station owner that he wouldn't pay for the gas until Clarence Thomas was allowed to use the restroom. He was allowed to use it by most accounts. Some people dispute it, but most accounts say Clarence did use the bathroom in that situation. But later that evening, when they checked into a hotel, he's going to be denied entry into the hotel with the rest of the players. He was the lone black player on this team. So he had to go back to the bus Branch Rickey was in his room, very, very upset by this. He made a mental note at this time that if he ever got in a position of power to change this, he would. This had a dramatic effect on Branch Rickey, and he arranged for a cot in his room and allowed Thomas to stay in his room, and he witnessed Thomas sobbing during this. Sorry, I just lost the PowerPoint. There we go. You know, black skin, if only I could make my skin white. And once again, this had a major impact on Branch Rickey. He would later, Branch Rickey in the 1930s would become the general manager of the St. Louis Cardinals. And he would, you know, African-American fans were only allowed to sit in the outfield area. If you've ever been to a baseball game, that's usually the cheapest seats, being so far away from the infield and home plate. He changed that policy when he was in St. Louis. If you remember, no blacks were allowed to play in Major League Baseball during this time. There were Negro leagues for which many great African-American players went and played, but they were not allowed to play in the major leagues. So when Branch Rickey becomes the general manager of the Dodgers, he starts a secret plan to bring in a black baseball player. Now, Branch Rickey also had an eye on winning, and he knew black baseball players could help him do that. They often lost to the Yankees. He was getting tired of that. He also knew that they could make the Dodgers a lot of money. He knew Brooklyn had and New York had a large African-American consumer base, and they would spend their money. He saw their money as green. So yes, he did have some moral reasons for doing this, but he also had some business reasons and competitive reasons for doing this as well. So he knew this would be tough to break the color barrier. So he wanted to pick a person, maybe not the best baseball player at the time, but someone who had the courage to basically endure all the insults and threats against him that he knew that this player would have to. He wanted somebody who was smart, somebody with a lot of courage, and somebody with a lot of character. And Jackie Robinson would be that player. He was somewhat older at this time than some younger black players. He had served in the Army. He also got in trouble in the Army for refusing to move to the back of the bus. Branch Rickey was aware of this as well. But by most accounts, Jackie Robinson had impeccable character. So he would be the choice. He, of course, had exceptional talent. And in 1946, Branch Rickey signed him, put him in the minor leagues with the eye of having him playing in the major leagues. So on April 15th, 1947, Jackie Robinson would become the first black baseball player in Major League history. So why should we care about this? That's the question. You could just say Mr. Betzler's going off on his love for baseball. But, you know, baseball is known as America's pastime. This is prior to the NFL being big. Television hadn't really taken off yet. It was in its beginning stages. Boxing and baseball were the two things that really mattered at this time. The NBA really couldn't compete with baseball at this time. So baseball mattered to people. So if a black player could make it in Major League Baseball, this would open the doors to African Americans in just about any other segment of society. So that's why it's so important. Okay, so we talk about him perhaps being a strange choice. There were other players that were better. He's 27 years old at this time, but Rickey believed Robinson had an outspoken mentality, courage, toughness, high degree of character needed for what this player would have to endure. And boy, did he have to endure it. See Jackie looking very young here. If we were in class, I would show you Jackie Robinson's last public appearance, which was in the early 1970s. He gave a speech at a baseball game on opening day, and he looks about 95 years old. The stress will be very, very difficult on Jackie Robinson. Okay. He asked Jackie Robinson not to fight back for 2 years. I would love to show you the opening clip to the movie 42, which came out a couple years ago, in which Branch Rickey proposes this to Jackie Robinson. Basically, for all the insults, all the trouble that's going to come his way, he's going to ask him not to fight back. He believes the only way that a black baseball player can successfully break the color barrier is, one, be a great baseball player, which Jackie was, and two, be a fine person, which Jackie was a better person and he was a baseball player. So it indeed took a lot of courage not to fight back. Members of his own team refused to play with him. When he showed up to spring training, some players threatened to quit. Branch Rickey had to go down and tell his manager to make sure that the players accepted him. Those who didn't often were traded off. He would face pitchers, that should say, not pictures, who tried to throw baseballs at his head. Runners coming into second base, in which the position Robinson played, tried to spike him, tried to hurt him. He received hate mail on a daily basis. Fans shouted racist remarks. Hotels and restaurants refused to serve him, so oftentimes he was staying in hotels separated from his teammates, eating in establishments that were also separate from his teammates. This is an interesting story about Pee Wee Reese, who's from Kentucky. You see on the right-hand side, both of these players would end up in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Pee Wee Reese is the team's leader. Shortstop, Jackie Robinson's in second base. They're in the second month of Robinson's career. Jackie's getting a bit down on the insults, the humiliation he's facing. One game in Cincinnati, the crowd was really, really nasty to Jackie. At one point, Jackie just put his head down. And as he stood there with his head down, Pee Wee Reese walked over across the field, stood there, put his arm around Jackie, and the crowd was silenced. This was a major gesture by the team leader. Jackie Robinson was accepted from that point on. If you ever go to Brooklyn, there's a statue of Pee Wee Reese and Jackie Robinson in that pose that you kind of see here, or that was on the field, obviously. This is a locker room photo. But Jackie Robinson never forgot this moment. He said it was a turning point for him. It wouldn't end the discrimination he would have to face, but it made him feel a lot better. And this is a significant moment in acceptance of a black baseball player. Okay. His actions on the field are going to affect the world far beyond Major League Baseball. And this type of courage and discipline, especially standing up against racism, or a preview of the actions taken by many members of the civil rights movement as we get into the 50s and 60s. Okay. So as we go through this unit, you're going to see a lot of the equality that minorities do achieve and are still fighting to achieve will come from the 14th Amendment. We saw this used in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Equal protection under the laws. Most times the Supreme Court up to this point had seen this basically was to deal with the slave issue, not to bolden it into civil rights. But many of the court's rulings over the next 25 years will be rooted in the 14th Amendment. So this isn't just going to be the story of African Americans. Many groups face discrimination, and we will look at those as well. Some groups still face it today. And once again, as we've seen in our history, most minorities in America have suffered and continue to suffer some form of discrimination, and we will be looking at that. So let's go back to where African Americans were supposedly free uh, from slavery. The 13th Amendment, um, here you see, ended slavery. And of course, the 14th Amendment, established in 1868, basically was here where people could not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law and must provide equal protection under the laws. Well, we're going to see for at least the next 100 years, this would not be the case, especially for African Americans. And the 15th Amendment gave citizens the right to vote, the number one power you can have in a democratic republic, but we're also going to see that the right to vote has been withheld from many groups. Women wouldn't get it till 1920, but despite the fact that you see race and color here, not should not be denied the right to vote, in practice they will continue to be denied the right to vote. So why were civil rights laws and these amendments ineffective? Okay, there are many reasons, but to show you a few things, these rights and amendments uh, basically started to be stripped away from especially 1865 to 1875, despite the fact that even some civil rights legislation was passed. Okay, the Ku Klux Klan, we've talked about a white supremacist basic terrorist group, was formed in 1866 and used a lot of terrorism against blacks. In 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. They said the federal government had gone too far. This was a states' right issue, not a federal issue. So if this Civil Rights Act of 1875 had been successful, we wouldn't have to study this unit of modern civil rights. Okay. We learned when we went over Brown versus Board of Education that Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 set up the Jim Crow system in the South, where separate but equal facilities were deemed legal, and this became the cornerstone of racial discrimination and would endure for minorities. Basically up to 1964. You could argue it's gone past 1964, but it's going to be the 1964 Civil Rights Act that finally is, when it comes to public places, legally get rid of discrimination. So as we move on, we see a lot of separate seats in public facilities, restaurants, theaters, hotel, bathrooms, drinking fountains. I usually hand out a sheet that shows you some more specific things. Blacks couldn't get haircuts from white barbers in some places. Blacks were denied the right to wrestle with whites in some schools. All kinds of crazy things that happened during this time. Okay, so we talked about, with the 15th Amendment, blacks get the right to vote. Well, how are they denied this? Well, often poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were instituted that prevented blacks. After slavery was abolished, they were very low on the socioeconomic ladder, so many didn't have the ability to pay those taxes. So that was a hurdle that was put in front of them. Literacy test, well, during slavery, not allowed to read, so can't expect them to be able to pass a literacy test in order to vote. And grandfather clauses in some states, well, if your grandfather was a slave, you can't have the right to vote. So you had all these different types of laws that deprived blacks the right to vote for decades. 1912, we see President Wilson, who was dismissed 15 of 17 black federal supervisors for whites in 1912. 1920, women finally get the right to vote. Look, as the Great Depression occurs, blacks suffer terrible discrimination, especially of whites. taking some of the jobs that blacks had. Black unemployment was much higher than whites. And even in the military through World War II, blacks were segregated. When I often think about, where to start this study, Jackie Robinson is where I started. I also often think about it, President Truman's executive order ending segregation in the military in the late 1940s. So that those two often get overlooked, but they are significant moments in the civil rights movement. So if you're not sure what segregation is, it's a separation of people according to race or ethnicity. Segregation can be about separating African Americans from whites or separating Hispanics from whites. We've seen that in our history. And before 1950, segregation was common and normal in the United States. And this type of policy deprived minorities of many of their rights and opportunities. Here you see a photo of water fountains, separate water fountains, restaurant. We looked at the Brown versus Board of Education. Just to review, this established that segregation of races in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the key part of this ruling was the court said that African Americans would be admitted to schools with all deliberate speed. For Southern states, that meant no speed at all. Okay. But this did not end segregation in our schools. There's a couple things here we have to look at that continued. We will look at how schools became legally desegregated with some of our topics of study that will be assigned in our projects. Okay. But we're going to see these schools, and you could argue today, especially in New Jersey, we have not achieved integration in the schools. So there were later attempts to try to integrate the schools because, as we know, you go to school where you live. And many of these school districts, you could even argue today, do not have a lot of diversity. Okay, so in order to try to address this, the policy of busing came up in the 1970s. This was the transporting of public school students from where they live to schools in other areas. This was mostly African American students being bused from lower socioeconomic areas to higher socioeconomic areas, mostly white schools. This was a controversial topic and policy. We saw Kamala Harris and Joe Biden argue over this in an earlier debate. Kamala Harris talking about how she was bused and helped her get a greater opportunity. And busing would be ended. It would be a very unpopular policy. And as we started getting more conservative courts in the 80s and 90s, they tended to back away on methods of desegregating schools by backing away from earlier attempts to bus students across neighborhoods. Okay? This is a term you should definitely know, de facto segregation. Look, there are a lot of studies that show that schools are becoming actually more segregated today because of de facto segregation. Patterns of racial resonance and other similar social conditions. I have some data that came out in the Star Ledger a few years ago. Let's look at New Jersey. The NAACP provided this statistic in 2015. New Jersey school districts, 611 we have. 31 of them, 5%, enroll more than 50% of all Black and Latino children in the state. 31 of the 611 districts have half of all minority children in the state. Okay, so let's look at Essex County. Of the 39,000 students in Newark, more than 36,000 are Black and Latino. That is not a school of diversity. Okay. In Milburn, fewer than 200 of its 4,000 students are Black and Latino, hardly integrated. Orange, New Jersey, only 12 of 4,400 students are white. And Fairfield, which goes to West Essex, 660 students are white, 33 are Latino, and one is Black. So that is an example of de facto segregation. Okay. Here's a very, very interesting picture that came out in the late 1940s. And what makes it interesting? Look at it for a second. On the right, you see Larry Doby, who ended up living in Montclair, New Jersey, most of his adult life. Passed away a couple years ago. Well, Jackie Robinson was the first African American baseball player, and he was in the National League. A few months later, Larry Doby was the first African American player in the American League, which meant he would be going to different cities than Jackie Robinson and be the first African American in many of these cities and had to face the same type of discrimination he did. Well, after a game, this picture was taken and it was in a lot of the newspapers the following day. It may seem laughable now, but you see a white man hugging a black man and they're cheek to cheek. That was a big deal, that picture. That showed acceptance, a very historic photo. This is Ernie Davis. If we were in school, we'd be watching the movie The Express. If you can get the movie The Express on Netflix or one of your streaming channels, please watch the movie. If we get back to school, we're definitely going to watch it. Ernie Davis played in Syracuse, New York, African-American running back. He was only one of there was a total of 3 African-Americans on the team. He was the first African-American to win the Heisman Trophy in college football. He shouldn't have been because he took over for the great Jim Brown, who was at Syracuse prior to him. He did not win the Heisman Trophy, despite being the best. The Heisman Trophies for the best college football player, but no African American had won it. He was there in the late 50s. He went on to play for the Cleveland Browns, and many NFL list when you name the greatest player of all time. Yes, I know some of you are going to say Tom Brady, but Jim Brown for decades has usually been at the top of the list. He broke every rushing record in the NFL in the 1960s. He later became a civil rights activist. He's still alive and helping with a lot of minority groups. So Jim Brown, some consider the greatest athlete of all time, great lacrosse player, power running back with lots of speed. And I know you guys probably never saw this. This was a very popular show in the 1960s, a television show called Star Trek. They made a lot of movies in the 80s. They continue some modern series, but this was the first interracial kiss. The white man you see there is Captain Kirk, the star of the show, and he kisses the character Uhura, who's on his crew. This was a big deal in the 1960s. This is all stuff. I shouldn't say stuff. Things that helped break barriers here in the United States. We're going to focus a lot on the media and television on how the civil rights movement used it to change things here in the United States. I'm going to finish up here with maybe one of your favorite cartoon strips, The Peanuts. Well, Franklin's not an original member. After Martin Luther King was assassinated, I believe it was a teacher wrote to the creator, Charles Schulz. The teacher was so despondent over the death of Martin Luther King and wanted to bring some more change to the United States in his honor. And I think it was she wrote a letter to Charles Schulz saying, you have this cartoon strip that people love. Is it possible to get an African American character into the strip? And Franklin was brought in to the Peanuts. So once again, some more change through the media in the 60s. Okay, so I'm going to be assigning in the near future you a topic for you to create a photo essay of either a person or an event on how they or it affected the civil rights movement. I mean, it's these pictures that tell the story that had the effect. So I think there's no better way of presenting the huge change that came to the United States in the 50s and 60s and continues today because of the modern civil rights movement. So I hope you enjoyed this. For now, we will cover some of the major legislation that was passed and achieved from this time period. Thank you very much.